So in light of our topic today, I want to first ask our panelists in their experience and perspective, what are some effective strategies for treating criminal justice clients? We'll start with Faye.
Well, thank you, Ginger, for a very thorough overview of, kind of the state of our knowledge here in terms of evidence-based practices. So the question that you've raised about what are some of the effective strategies for treating clients in the criminal justice system, I'm going to focus on two aspects. One is the role of the criminal justice system or the probation and parole officer or community corrections officer. And the second one I want to talk about is the role of the offender. So you elegantly talked about the fact that, we're in a world now in which we're not talking about treatment as being the end-all. It's really a collaborative process. I use the term seamless system as a model of what that collaboration where, from the client or the offender's perspective, the same information is being shared across systems, the same information is being used to gauge progress in terms of the goals in public safety and clinical goals. That means that one of the effective strategies is that the probation officer is really part of the process, and it's not a handoff. Where, the probation and parole officer thinks that, once they send the person to treatment, it's really about what the treatment agency is doing in terms of evidence-based practices, whether they're using a CBT model, whether they're using some sort of, co-occurring model that deals with both mental health and substance abuse issues, but really that the probation officer in and of themselves think of themselves as being part of that intervention. And you mentioned this, Ginger, and I think it's an important part for people to really stress because even though we have different organizations, we have treatment agencies and we have probation and parole, what we're really moving forward to is a model in which people have to work together, both in terms of the clinical and the supervision of the offender. So we need to recognize that what the probation and parole officer does also needs to follow the same tenets that you've identified. And they need to deal with, the offender and the treatment provider similarly in terms of obtaining information and sharing information. They're partners in many ways. That means that the planning for the supervision plan for an offender is part of the treatment process. Better programs are ones in which the supervision and treatment plans are really similar. They complement each other, and from the client's perspective or the offender's perspective, they know what the target behaviors are that everyone's interested in. They see that the criminal justice agency and the treatment agencies, understand those target behaviors and are focusing together. And they're using the same tools to monitor success. So we need to have sort of this boundaryless picture, mostly from the notion that the client is part of this process, and the client really needs to understand that, the two systems agree upon key behaviors. So that's one part of an effective strategy. The second part of the effective strategy, and I think that given where we are in our history of criminal justice practice, this is critically important, that we really need to see the offenders in what in the medical literature is called the shared decision-making process. We need the offenders to be part of developing and monitoring their supervision plan in a way in which the offender is helping to decide what types of activities or target behaviors are most important. That's why when you were giving out the information about, what you get out of your LSCMI, sharing that information with an offender so they can say, okay, I see I'm high risk on recreation, so what are some of the things that I want to do to address those issues? And that's part of a shared decision-making model in which the offender can actually contribute to a discussion about which one of the areas criminogenic needs should more attention be paid to. I mention that because more often than not, we think that in order to deliver treatment and supervision services, that we need to tell people what they need to do. And everything we know about people changing behaviors is that people don't change when people tell them what to do. So, thinking about an effective strategy in terms of engaging the client offender in the decision-making process about what's the priority for their treatment supervision plans, what are their target behaviors and goals, can really move us quite a bit ahead. And it also helps the person, develop some of that more intrinsic motivation, which is what we're trying to achieve under correctional control, is getting the person more, motivated to address and manage their own risky behaviors. So those are my 2 points on effective strategies.
Engaging the client offender in their treatment plan is something the treatment field's been doing for a long time, and I think it's an idea we can borrow in corrections to become more effective. Chris, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I also have a couple of thoughts on the issue, and I recently read an article that was authored by Frank Cullen. It's called "Taking Rehabilitation Seriously: Creativity, Science, and the Challenge of Offender Change." And he's got a line in there that I think is a really important thing to consider. And that line states this: it says, "Conservatives deny the humanity of offenders, whereas liberals deny the pathology of offenders." And I think that's an incredible quote, and I think it really reflects a couple of things. One of the things I think it reflects is this continuing shift of this pendulum in corrections to go to one extreme or the other. And I think when I look at this quote, and when I think about it, and I think about the history of corrections and the recent history of corrections, I think we always run that danger of swinging one way, too far one way or the other. So one of the things that I would stress is that we use a balanced approach when we deal with offenders. Whether we're talking about treatment exclusively or supervision exclusively, the data is continuing to come in that indicates if you're too far on one side of this pendulum, meaning you're either focused too much on the punishment and control aspects or you're focused too much on the treatment aspects, you don't get anywhere. So you really have to have a balanced approach in how you deal with offenders and how you interact with them, how you intervene, and how you treat them. So that's one thing that I would really stress. Don't go too far one way or the other in terms of your approach in dealing with offenders. The other thing that I would say in terms of doing corrections effectively or doing it well, and we haven't done this, we've been really poor at paying attention to the quality and the implementation of some of these evidence-based practices. When you start to look at what is involved in training and when you start to look at what is involved in technology transfer, I think oftentimes our efforts in correctional settings to train officers or to train treatment staff in new innovations is going to fall way short of what it needs to be. I also think there's been quite a we've been pretty out of tune with this whole idea of fidelity of implementation and really tracking how well did we implement what we chose as our intervention. How well did we monitor officers' acquisition of skill or treatment staff's acquisition of skill, and are they using it? It's one thing to teach them in the classroom and to have them role play it in the classroom, but then the question becomes, what happens when they're in their office or they're in group with offenders? Are they using these skills, and are they doing them well? The research shows that a evidence-based program, poorly implemented, can increase failure rates compared to giving offenders nothing at all. So we really have to pay attention to the quality of the services that are delivered. I don't think there's so much of a question anymore as to what should we do. I think the question really becomes, well, how do we do it well? And so for me, it's an issue of quality.
Thanks, Chris. That's actually a great lead into our next question. As you say, fidelity is of critical importance in treating criminal justice clients. Let's turn to our panel to talk about their thoughts and experiences. How can corrections practitioners make sure their programming is evidence-based and that the right people are getting into the right programs? Maureen, I understand that Connecticut's Court Support Services Division has developed a treatment data system to monitor fidelity and to provide opportunities for continuous quality improvement. Could you tell us more about that innovative work?
Sure. Here in Connecticut, data is playing a more and more important role, not only in making sure that the right clients get to the right programs, but also that the services that are being delivered well, and that the clients are better off as a result of receiving those services. So in this first slide, what we'll show is that there are 3 data sources in Connecticut that we link together. The first is our case management information system. This is a system that our probation officers use, that our family and pretrial staff enter data into. And from this data source, we can determine things like what's the client's risk level, what are their top criminogenic needs. We can look at typical case management information, like how many contacts they've had with the client, and we can tell if the client successfully completed probation. We link that information with our contractor data collection system, which is a relatively new web-based data system, and all of the providers that we contract with are required to enter client-level data into this system. From this source, we can learn things like what are the demographics and the risk level of the clients that are referred to those services, what services were they enrolled in, what the dosage of the service they received, and if they finished the service, and if they didn't, why they didn't finish it. And then the third thing that we throw into the mix is arrest data. We get some files from the state police department, and we can tell who's been arrested. And so when we integrate these 3 sources, it gives us this really nice continuum of what happens from the moment that a client enters the door, starting with what the assessment told us about what the client's risk and needs were. And we can follow that out and see, were they referred to a program? Were they referred to the right services? Did they complete those services or not? And then we can look out 6, 12 months, a year, 2 years, and see if that client was ultimately rearrested or was not rearrested. Now, we do a lot of things with this data, but one of the most important things that we're doing right now is we're selecting performance measures, and we do that for each individual service model. When we select them, we make sure that the measures that we select are grounded in the research that we know that tells us what already works. And so what you'll see now is you see a sample. It's a screenshot from our contractor data collection system. Actually, I think, yeah, there we go. This is a sample screenshot from our contractor data collection system. This is a client that was scheduled to begin TAD, which is a substance abuse group, on March 23rd. And this client finished all 12 sessions, so they got the full dose of the treatment, and they completed on July 6th of 2010. Now, this relatively simple data entry can be rolled up, and we can use this information that the contractors are entering into the system to see how well clients are doing in that particular program. And I'll show that on the next slide. So what you're seeing now is an excerpt from one of our performance measure reports. And I know there's a lot of numbers, so I put a little yellow flag in there to try and direct your attention to one of the measures. So we look at service completion. And so the flag is pointing to the service completion for TAD. And so the client that we just looked at, where that client had finished TAD, that client and other clients like them would be rolled up, and we can look and see for the most recent quarter, 71% of the clients that were enrolled in TAD completed that curriculum. And that's above our goal. The goal that we set for that quarter was 70%, and they're at 71%. And not only can we look at how we're doing now, but we can look historically and see where have we been. And so if we work backwards a little bit, you see in the previous quarter we were at 69, and in all of 2009 we had 67% of clients that completed. So we've seen some modest gains, and we've actually achieved the goal that we set for ourselves in terms of delivering services and having clients actually complete the intervention. One of the nice features is, this is a statewide report, but then you can drill down, and so you can actually drill into each measure and see how are the different locations doing in comparison to each other, and we can even drill down to the client level, so we could look and see, Mary Jones finished TAD, but Steve Smith did not finish, so we can get to that client level. So this is one example of some of the performance measures we're looking at. I'm just going to throw out a few other examples of things that we measure. One is we have quality assurance ratings, which are basically assessments of staff and how well they're delivering the evidence-based curriculum with fidelity to the model. So they're actually scored, and we look at those, and we set goals for what we want to achieve in that particular that measure. We also get some feedback from the clients through a survey called The Way, and that measures therapeutic alliance. So we can see how clients feel about their relationship with program staff. We measure the clients that gain employment if they're enrolled in services that target employment services. And then for just about all of them, we're looking at the recidivism rate, so looking out 12 months to see if the clients are actually getting arrested or not getting arrested. And I would say the most important aspect, these reports are great on their face just with the numbers, but one of the most important things that we do is we get the service service deliverers together with the criminal justice staff, so the probation officers and the bail staff and the service providers all to get together every quarter when these reports come out. And it gives them a chance to kind of celebrate what's going well, but also to problem solve and really talk about the areas that they're struggling. And so I think we heard Faye and Ginger talk before about, that there's different approaches or mindsets from those two people. It's getting those two groups together to really talk about what they can do to make the system work more efficiently.
Thank you, Maureen. That's an amazing system, and I am guessing many members of our audience are feeling envious about having that kind of resource available. Chris, I wonder what your thoughts are about this question.
Yeah, I would. The system that Maureen just demonstrated is a great system, and I think that's really what it's all about, is giving agencies feedback as to how they're actually doing relative to these to the different principles that they're trying to implement. We've started to do some of that in the federal system as well, and we're giving districts feedback about who it is they're targeting in terms of the risk level of the offenders, how much money is being spent on each offender by risk category, and also how much officer time is being spent. And the measure we use is the number of contacts throughout supervision by risk level as well. And we're also giving them feedback about recidivism rates too. So we're starting to do some of that. And I think one of the goals for us is that we get it to the officer level, where districts are giving this feedback to the individual officers, because that then allows at that very micro level, it allows officers, you could apply this to treatment programs as well, it either allows an officer or a counselor to say, boy, this is what I'm supposed to be doing, spending most of my time with high-risk offenders or moderate to high-risk offenders, and what does my data tell me personally about how I'm doing, and do I need to make any adjustments? So I think that's one critical piece, is monitoring through data what's going on, who you're actually targeting, who you're spending your time with, and so on. I think the other big issue, though, in terms of monitoring is, again, it gets back to observation. And observation, I think, would also be related, it's related to training as well. But really that issue of sitting in and seeing what goes on in a group, what goes on in one-on-one interactions, and providing the officer, the counselor, some coaching about those skills. There's some interesting research that comes from the field of teaching that teachers do not really pick up on new ways to teach in the classroom unless you actually go to their classroom and teach them or coach them in their classroom. So I think that probably applies to some degree, at least in terms of my own experiences in watching our efforts in corrections, that we can train officers and case managers and counselors all day long in a classroom setting, but unless you go back to their place of work and sit in and help them apply it, they kind of drift towards doing what they've always been doing. So I think that's another big issue that we have to consider, is how do we transfer this technology. I think keeping up on it and making sure it stays in place once it's in place is a lot easier than getting it there in the first place.
Thanks, Chris.
Yep.
What are your thoughts, Faye?
Well, what Maureen described is like an idyllic system. So Connecticut really should applaud itself for the hard work that they've done over the last 5-7 years to put this together. What I would suggest to add on to what Maureen and Chris have already talked about is that, one of the things that we tend to want to do is really focus on the long-range goal of rearrest reductions and rearrest, which of course is what the mission of the criminal justice system is about. But oftentimes you can't get to that finishing line until you start making changes in your processes and before that. And so one thing that's happened, for example, in the substance abuse literature over the last decade has been this real focus on much more earlier on process improvement. And the notion here is that basically, the hardest thing we know about treatment is getting people to show up. And in fact, everything we know about treatment is, even if it's not the best treatment, if people still continue to show up, they still do better than not showing up at all. So in the substance abuse treatment literature, there has been over the last decade this movement to these process measures. And they measure things like the length of time from referral to when the person first shows up for an assessment, the length of time to initiate the treatment, the engagement of the client in treatment within the first month, the retention of the client in treatment within the first 30 or 90 days, depending upon the length of the treatment program, and then the completion rate. Now, if you can see what they're basically doing is they're basically suggesting that to augment and give feedback to these groups to really look at how well the system is working, we really have to focus on the process and whether or not the way in which we deliver services is really effective for this population. Since we're talking about mergers between criminal justice and treatment agencies, I suggest that kind of something that organizations may want to do, these groups that Maureen talked about getting together people, is to really look at how well they're doing from a process standpoint. Because the data points of referrals, days to referrals, days that the client initiates, days engaged in treatment, and days retained in treatment, all of those can really tell us how well the criminal justice treatment systems are working together collaboratively. And I would recommend that if people are interested in this model, you can go to the NIATX website, which is www.niatx.org, and they have a very nice description of these process measures and also some kind of case studies about how organizations have looked at enhancing their processes. What this does is it basically puts the burden really on the systems to say, so how well are we doing as a system in order trying to get better client outcomes? And it allows people to really kind of work together to think more about what can we do. Maureen talked about her meetings, and those are really critically important. But they have a couple sort of process measures, process training tools, sort of similar to what Chris is talking about, you know, in terms of trying to look at how well the systems are working, that people can actually experiment. So I would highly suggest that, you know, we think more in this area about how we can make it easier for people to get in the front door and make it easier for clients to stay, even though, you know, particularly as we work with the higher risk clients, that's going to be our challenge, is engaging that person and getting them to come back. And, you know, if we're successful in doing that, then we will be successful because, as I said, you know, what we do know about treatment and most things in life, showing up is important.
Thanks, Faye. Chris, you had another comment?
Yeah, just listening to Faye talk about the whole idea of process really got me to think about something else that has been discussed in corrections recently, and that's the idea or that's the question, you know, what are we responsible for? Are we responsible for recidivism rates and ultimate outcome? Of course, that's what we target, and that's what we want to go after. But the question becomes, you know, what are we held responsible for? And I think the answer to that question is we're responsible for providing the best supervision or the best treatment as indicated by the research and the evidence base. And so this really gets to the issue that Faye's bringing up. Start looking at the process of what you're doing. You know, I think that requires you to be aware of what the best practices are and what the evidence-based practices are to make sure you implement them, and then make sure you monitor that implementation once you're done with it. So, you know, for me, once an agency starts to get some of these practices in place, these evidence-based practices, and some of the programs that are supported by the research, the goal for me as an administrator would be to make sure that those things stay in place and that we make adaptations to them as our data or other evidence that comes in would indicate. So that's something to think about, too, is really focusing on the process. Are we doing well what we're supposed to be doing well?
Right. Thanks, Chris. We have one last question for the panel before we move on to audience questions, and it's a practical question. If we're focusing on providing effective treatment for higher risk clients, what are some of those practical implications for corrections and for treatment practitioners? And Chris, you've, I think, started answering this question already, but if you have other thoughts you'd like to share, this would be a good time to do that.
Sure. The other thing, one of the things that I would suggest, and this is based largely on our experiences in Ohio, A number of years ago, we conducted a study that indicated that many of the offenders that were being referred to halfway houses were not high risk. They were, in fact, moderate and low risk offenders. And so one of the things that the state did is they started shifting who they referred to these halfway houses. Two things happened. One, the AWOL rate went through the roof, and the other thing that has been reported is that staff turnover picked up a little bit. And I think one of the things that we have to do in corrections is we have to prepare our staff. If we're going to move towards targeting higher risk offenders, we have to prepare our staff to deal with them, because I think the nature of the job changes, and the level of frustration and the level, the kind of work changes as you move from dealing with a mixed risk caseload, whether you're talking treatment or supervision, to an exclusively higher risk caseload. So I think it does require some preparation in terms of training and also the expectations. So that would probably be my biggest caution as you move towards this process of targeting the higher risk offenders. You have to prepare staff. What does that really mean? What does that look like? As you had pointed out, Ginger, oftentimes our practice in corrections is to exclude the highest risk offenders from programming. You see it in substance abuse, where their first positive drug screen gets them excluded from treatment. You certainly see it in the sex offender realm, where if offenders refuse to admit, they're not even allowed to begin in a group. So I think oftentimes we have been excluding the offenders that we're now saying we're going to target and spend most of our time with. So we might not have the experience that we need to do that effectively, or to do that in a way that doesn't create lots of stress and anxiety. So that would be my suggestion.
Right. Thanks, Chris. I've noticed that in Oregon, both as we've asked treatment professionals to deal with a different group, but also with probation parole officers who tend to want to keep on to hold of their cases even as they move into a lower risk to reoffend, because those are the people who show up and appreciate their probation parole officer, whereas the higher risk people aren't so likely to do that.
Absolutely, and those low-risk cases oftentimes validate what we do. They're the successes that we can point to.
That's right.
That make it worthwhile.
Yep. Okay, what are your thoughts?
Well, I want to add on to Chris's focus on staff, and then also talk about this whole issue about technology transfer. So going back to the issue about staff, one of the reasons why thinking about using some of the motivational interviewing technology, and I use the term technology here because MI is a skill, but it also has embedded in it some ideas that I think sometimes are useful in helping staff learn to deal with clients. And the two I want to pick were ones that when I was doing my work in the state of Maryland and then some work with the state of Virginia, that the staff seem to have the most difficult time with is the concepts of rolling with resistance and the techniques for basically dealing with discrepancies. Because we're dealing with a high-risk population, they have very embedded behaviors, their attitudes and mannerisms sometimes are very difficult to deal with on an interpersonal level. So I think, organizations can really think about the rolling with resistance and those strategies that go along with that technique as helping staff to learn to prepare for when when you have this, person who really is not that interested, and the staff get very discouraged and frustrated with that behavior. Similarly, because we're dealing with people's lifestyles and their behaviors, a lot of people oftentimes, will give us information that may not be accurate. Some people call this lying. Other people call it, trying to protect someone's ego. But, the issue is teaching staff to really use those discrepancy skills so they can better prepare for dealing with that population, because that's one way of helping to unravel for the client that, there are things they need to come to terms with. So those are two techniques I think are important. The other thing I wanted to mention is, and Chris talked about this, about technology transfer and us thinking about how to get things into the front line and get people using these skills. We recently finished an experiment actually in a juvenile justice agency where we did an experiment to advance the use of basically the caseworkers taking the risk needs information on the kids that came in the front door and trying to use it on a case plan, and then also refer kids to the appropriate services. And our experiment was really about what organizational strategy would basically help the staff use the, the risk needs principles in their case planning. And, so we had outcomes related to both, the staff's behavior, but also impact on the the youth behaviors. Now, one of the things we did is we had two styles of coaching that we were using. One was a coach model that actually was a refresher of the skills that they learned in an intensive training, and that occurred 4 times over 1 year. And we basically picked 4 main skills, and they came back in and did these booster sessions. That was one arm of the study. The other arm of the study is that we developed in each of the study sites that was assigned to that arm, we basically developed a social network within that organization to deal with the stress of trying to use the new skills. And so the focus of that was basically around helping to develop expertise within the system, but also have a point person that everyone could go to talk about the stress on their jobs, the multiple demands that people had, the difficulty people had using information. And the underlying theory of that whole notion was that one thing we know about technology transfer is that the social network within an organization has to be supportive of the new idea or the refinement of old ideas. So, what we learned in this study was actually the social network booster sessions had improvements in the climate of the sites that were participating in the studies. They also had improvements on the staff basically referring kids to appropriate services based on risk needs. And the kids that were assigned to that arm, the staff that were doing that, actually had lower rearrest rates than the kids in the other 2 arms. And we didn't see much of a difference between the knowledge-based kind of booster sessions, and then we had a total control group. So I think one of the things that we really need to think about in this technology transfer world is how we're thinking about building up the staff commitment to this. And that has to do with the leadership in that organization and the support we give the staff as they're in this new learning mold. I think what we know from the technology transfer literature, that how we do change is equally important, similar to how we try and change individual behaviors. And so our challenge, I think, is to rethink some of the training tools that we have existing in the field today. So those are the 2 points I wanted to kind of focus on, is, kind of helping staff learn some new skills, but also thinking through this whole technology transfer model and what we're emphasizing there.
Thanks, Faye. I know in Oregon we're really looking now at the role of the first-line supervisor and how that role needs to change to support this learning acquisition of new skills. Maureen, based on Connecticut's application of your new data system, what have you found in your experience implementing that system?
Well, in Connecticut, our goal is to make sure that all our referrals are assessment-driven, and also we want to concentrate our resources on meeting the multiple needs of the higher-risk clients. We start by making sure that that's reinforced through staff training. All our agency policies support it, and we have a caseload structure that also reflects that. But as I think we've all experienced, and as Chris just pointed out with implementation, people and systems are really complicated, and you can't just expect because you've trained or because you've put something in policy that it's going to actually reflect exactly what you want it to. So what we do is we draw our data systems, and that's one of the ways that we're monitoring to see how well the theory of serving higher risk clients more intensely is actually translating into daily practice. We are using the data, and what it shows us is what's actually happening, and sometimes that's, it's great because we see things working out the way we want them to, and other times we recognize that we need to make adjustments in the system. in Connecticut, we use the LSIR and the ACESR, and so the probation officers or the service providers that are administering that, they enter that into our data system. And from that, we can identify the pools of the higher risk clients. We can separate those from the medium and the low. And we can also stratify the clients by their top criminogenic needs. Now, this data system is relatively new, and so I think we're just starting to scratch the surface of how we can incorporate that information into our day-to-day operations. But one of the things that we've been focusing on is that implementing the data system actually takes a lot of time in and of itself. And so over the first few years of implementing it, we've really just been focusing on making sure that the data system reflected the business practice of the providers. And we've really had to put a lot of effort into data quality to make sure that it's timely and that it's accurate. But I can give you some examples of ways that we're starting to use this, this risk information in practice and ways that we want to use it in the future. One example is we can take a look at programs. So, for example, if we have a program that's designed for high-risk clients, we now can identify of all the referrals that are sent to that program, how many of them actually are high risk. And if we see that there's a big influx of the lower or the medium risk in a program that's designed for high risk, then we can step in and go back and see what the disconnect is and go back to the referral source and see if there's a better way to allocate resources. Another example would be treatment matching. So if we have a lot of clients, that we can take a look and see what's the pool of clients, for example, that score high for substance abuse. And then we can take that client and follow out through our data system to see were they referred to a program that can meet that need by offering treatment that relates to that need so that they can offer substance abuse treatment. And then one more example, we haven't started to do this, but we're going to soon. We have a lot of programs that deliver case management services, and there's an expectation that the higher risk will have more frequent and more intense case management services than for the medium risk. And so what we'll be doing is we'll be stratifying the clients that are getting case management, and we'll be able to see, in fact, that when you look at the average number of case management sessions, are they higher than the ones for the medium risk? And if we see that they're not, then we know that we still have work to do in taking that concept and the theory of serving higher risk clients and turning that into daily practice. So those are just some examples of ways that we're trying to make the goal of targeting the higher risk clients, make sure that that's actually happening in our offices.
Okay, thanks, Maureen, and thanks to everyone for your expertise and thoughts on those questions.